February 8, 1971. Landing Zone Ranger North, Laos. 2 kilometers across the border from South Vietnam. The Huey helicopter dropped fast through morning haze toward clearing in elephant grass where intelligence said enemy presence was minimal. And through the open door I could see the Laotian jungle stretching to horizons, triple canopy vegetation broken only by mountains, terrain that had been NVA sanctuary for years, ground that American soldiers weren't legally allowed to occupy, but where I was about to land anyway. I was Chief Warrant Officer 2 Dave Patterson, helicopter pilot with Alpha Troop, 2nd Squadron, 17th Cavalry, 101st Airborne Division, 26 years old from Montana, flying my 247th combat mission, beginning an operation that would become the bloodiest helicopter battle in American military history, that would cost more aircraft and crews than any operation since the war began, that would prove conclusively that Vietnamization, turning the war over to South Vietnamese forces, was failing catastrophically. Operation Lam Son 719 was supposed to demonstrate that ARVN could conduct major offensive operations with only American air support, that South Vietnamese forces had been trained and equipped adequately to fight without American ground troops, that Vietnamization was succeeding. The plan was strategically sound. ARVN forces would invade Laos along Route 9, advance approximately 40 kilometers to the town of Chapon, cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail's primary infiltration routes, destroy enemy supply caches, demonstrate that communist logistics network could be interdicted permanently. But the plan had fatal flaws that everyone involved understood, but command refused to acknowledge. The ARVN forces assigned to the operation, approximately 16,000 soldiers from elite airborne and marine units, were insufficient for mission scope. The terrain favored defenders who'd had years to prepare positions. The NVA had approximately 36,000 soldiers in the area, outnumbering ARVN forces substantially and possessing better motivation because they were defending territory they considered their own. And critically, American ground forces were prohibited from crossing into Laos by congressional restrictions passed after Cambodia incursion, meaning ARVN would be supported only by air assets, whose effectiveness in jungle terrain had always been limited. The helicopter aviation units supporting Lam Son 719 included over 600 aircraft, the largest concentration of American aviation assets in single operation since war began. UH-1 Hueys would insert and extract troops, conduct resupply missions, evacuate casualties. AH-1 Cobra gunships would provide close air support. CH-47 Chinooks would move artillery and supplies. CH-54 Sky Cranes would recover downed aircraft. The aviation commitment was massive, demonstrating American determination to make operations succeed despite growing skepticism about war's purpose and inevitable outcome. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Bobby Molinelli commanded Alpha Troop, 34 years old from New Jersey, professional officer who'd been flying helicopters in Vietnam since 1968, understood both capabilities and limitations of aviation in supporting ground operations. Molinelli had expressed concerns about operation during planning, the concentration of aviation assets, the vulnerability to anti-aircraft fire, the difficulty of supporting ARVN forces who'd never conducted operations at this scale. "We're flying into a hornet's nest," Molinelli told aviators during briefing February 7th, day before operation began. "NVA controls Laos. They've positioned anti-aircraft weapons throughout the area. .51 caliber machine guns, 37mm cannons, SA-7 surface-to-air missiles. They know we're coming. They're prepared. Some of us won't come back. What matters is completing the mission, supporting ARVN, proving American aviation can tip the balance even when ground forces are restricted." The briefing was sobering because Molinelli wasn't sugarcoating reality. Helicopter pilots understood that flying into areas with concentrated anti-aircraft weapons meant accepting casualties, that survival was a combination of skill and luck, that every mission might be the last. But mission was clear. Support ARVN forces attempting to cut Ho Chi Minh Trail, prove Vietnamization was working despite mounting evidence suggesting otherwise. Chief Warrant Officer Thomas "Tommy" Henderson was my co-pilot. 24 years old, from Texas, had been flying in Vietnam for 8 months, possessed a combination of competence and optimism that hadn't yet been tempered by seeing how badly operations could go. Henderson believed what command said about operations prospects and hadn't yet developed the cynicism that comes from watching plans fail despite brave soldiers executing them perfectly. "You really think this is as dangerous as Mullinelli says?" Henderson asked while we pre-flighted aircraft February 8th morning. "ARVN has been training for years. They're equipped with best weapons we have. Air support will be massive. How can they fail?" "They can fail by being outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and outmotivated," I replied, drawing on experience Henderson hadn't accumulated. "ARVN has equipment but lacks leadership and motivation that wins battles. The NVA are defending their territory, fighting for a cause they believe in. We're supporting an army that's fighting because we're making them. That's a recipe for disaster." Specialist Robert "Bobby" Miller was crew chief on our Huey, 22 years old, from Ohio, responsible for maintaining aircraft and manning the door gun during missions. Miller had been with Alpha Troop for 10 months, had survived over 200 combat missions, developed a sixth sense about when situations were deteriorating. His nervousness about Lam Son 719 reflected broader anxiety throughout aviation units who understood this operation was different from previous missions. "I've got a bad feeling about this," Miller told me while loading ammunition for the door gun. "Too many helicopters, too concentrated, too much enemy in the area. We're going to lose birds. Question is how many." The operation began at 0700 hours February 8th, when ARVN airborne forces crossed the border into Laos, advancing along Route 9 toward first objectives. American helicopters inserted forces onto landing zones, conducted resupply missions, provided close air support. Initial resistance was moderate: scattered ground fire, some anti-aircraft weapons, nothing suggesting the concentrated defenses that would develop over following weeks. But NVA response was strategic rather than immediate. They understood that massing forces against initial insertions would alert Americans to their presence. Better to allow ARVN to penetrate deeper into Laos, to extend supply lines, to become dependent on helicopter support that could be systematically destroyed once NVA committed their anti-aircraft weapons and ground forces. By February 10th, ARVN forces had advanced approximately 15 kilometers into Laos, established several firebases, seemed to be achieving their objectives with fewer casualties than pessimists predicted. Command declared operation was succeeding, that ARVN was performing well, and that Vietnamization was being validated. Media coverage was cautiously optimistic. Perhaps South Vietnamese forces really could fight effectively without American ground troops. Then, on February 11th, NVA counterattacked with a force that shattered optimistic assessments. Tank-led assaults, supported by artillery, overran Firebase 31, killing or capturing most defenders, demonstrating that NVA possessed armor and firepower that exceeded intelligence estimates. And critically, NVA anti-aircraft defenses became fully operational. The 51 caliber machine guns and 37mm cannons that had been carefully positioned and camouflaged began engaging helicopters systematically. What had been a dangerous flying environment became a killing ground where aircraft survival was measured in minutes rather than missions. Part 2. The Gauntlet. February 12th through February 20th. The helicopter losses began mounting with horrifying speed. On February 12th alone, 7 helicopters were shot down and 35 damaged badly enough to require extensive repairs. The pattern would repeat daily: multiple aircraft destroyed, dozens damaged, crews killed or wounded or captured, aviation units suffering casualties at rates exceeding what could be sustained if operation continued at current intensity. My first aircraft loss came February 14th during extraction mission at Landing Zone Ranger South. We'd inserted ARVN troops morning,
were returning afternoon to extract them after their reconnaissance mission. The approach was through valley, where hills on both sides channeled helicopters into predictable flight paths, perfect terrain for anti-aircraft ambush. "This approach looks bad," Henderson observed over intercom as we descended toward LZ. "Hills on both sides, only one way in and out, perfect place for ambush." "Everything about this operation looks bad," I replied, but continued approach because ARVN troops needed extraction, and refusing mission wasn't an option. "Stay alert. If we take fire, I'm breaking off immediately. No heroics." The anti-aircraft fire began when we were 200 meters from LZ, multiple .51 caliber positions firing simultaneously from hillsides, creating crossfire that helicopters couldn't avoid. Tracers arced toward us, green streams that seemed slow until you realized how fast bullets were actually traveling. The impacts came immediately, rounds punching through thin aluminum skin, destroying systems, killing crew members before anyone could react. "Taking fire! Multiple hits! We're going down!" I transmitted while fighting controls that were becoming unresponsive, while master caution lights illuminated showing multiple system failures, while Henderson worked through emergency procedures that couldn't save aircraft that was too damaged to fly. The auto-rotation was textbook, lowering collective to maintain rotor RPM, finding landing spot that wasn't perfect but was survivable, flaring at last moment to bleed airspeed. We head hard but upright, skids collapsing but fuselage intact, crew and passengers shaken but alive. The Huey was destroyed, would never fly again, but everyone aboard survived crash. "Everyone out! Move away from aircraft! It might catch fire!" I shouted while unbuckling, while helping Henderson and passengers evacuate, while Specialist Miller provided covering fire toward the hillsides that shot us down. The extraction from crashed helicopter was a textbook rescue operation. Another Huey from Alpha Troop landed despite continuing fire, loaded our crew and passengers, extracted under fire that damaged but didn't down the rescuing aircraft. We'd lost a helicopter, but saved crew. Success by the standards of operation, where losing aircraft had become routine, but losing crews was still considered unacceptable. But not everyone was so fortunate. Over the next week, dozens of helicopters were shot down with crews who didn't survive crashes, who were killed by ground fire while waiting for rescue, who were captured by NVA forces and would spend years as prisoners of war or never be seen again. The casualty rate for aviation units supporting Lam Son 719 exceeded anything experienced previously. Pilots were completing 1 or 2 missions before being shot down. Crews were being rotated through replacement pipeline faster than they could be trained. Units were losing cohesion as experienced aviators were killed or wounded and replaced by inexperienced pilots who were killed or wounded in turn. Chief Warrant Officer Mike Jefferson, was shot down February 16th during resupply mission, crashed in territory controlled by NVA, was captured along with his crew. Jefferson would spend 2 years as POW, would be released in 1973 after the Paris Peace Accords, would return home with injuries, physical and psychological, that would affect him for life. His capture demonstrated that flying in Laos meant risking not just death, but capture and years of imprisonment in conditions that violated Geneva Conventions. The ARVN ground situation deteriorated as rapidly as aviation situation. Forces that had advanced confidently into Laos were now defending against counterattacks that threatened to destroy them. Firebase after firebase was overrun or evacuated under pressure. Supply lines were interdicted. Casualties mounted faster than replacements could arrive. The operation that was supposed to demonstrate ARVN capabilities was instead demonstrating that without American ground forces, ARVN couldn't conduct sustained offensive operations against determined NVA resistance. By February 20th, ARVN commanders were requesting permission to withdraw from Laos. The operation's objectives hadn't been achieved. Chapone had not been secured. Ho Chi Minh Trail had not been cut. Supply caches had not been destroyed, but continuing meant accepting casualties that would destroy ARVN units committed to operation. The decision was made to declare victory based on casualties inflicted on the enemy and then withdraw before ARVN units were annihilated. But withdrawal from Laos would prove even more costly than advance had been.
Part 3. The Retreat. February 21st through March 24th. The ARVN withdrawal from Laos became rout as NVA forces pursued aggressively, attacking retreating columns, ambushing convoys, overrunning units that couldn't move fast enough. The discipline and organization that had characterized advance dissolved under pressure of fighting withdrawal against enemy who sensed victory and pressed attacks with intensity that suggested they understood this was chance to destroy ARVN forces completely. Helicopter operations during withdrawal were most dangerous missions of the entire war. Landing zones were hot, under fire continuously, surrounded by NVA forces, requiring pilots to land despite anti-aircraft fire that was destroying aircraft systematically. Extractions became desperate races. Get in, load troops, get out before being shot down, repeat until everyone was evacuated or no helicopters remained operational. I flew my most dangerous mission March 1st during extraction from Firebase Hope. ARVN firebase that had been under siege for days was being evacuated because position had become untenable. The firebase was on hilltop, surrounded by NVA forces. Landing zone was tiny, maybe large enough for one helicopter at a time, and was under continuous fire from surrounding positions. Ranger lead, this is Firebase Hope, a radio call from Firebase commander, voice carrying desperation that made clear situation was critical. We need immediate extraction. We're nearly overrun. If you don't get us now, you won't get us at all. Roger, Hope. Inbound for extraction. Prep your wounded for loading. We'll take as many as we can fit. My response, knowing that mission might be suicide, but refusing wasn't an option when Americans and ARVN were depending on us. The approach to Firebase Hope was through a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire that exceeded anything I'd experienced. Every hillside seemed to have 5.1 caliber positions, firing, creating crossfire that was impossible to avoid. Tracers filled the air like lethal rain, rounds impacting on aircraft before we'd even reach the LZ. The Huey was hit repeatedly, systems failing, warning lights illuminating, controls becoming sluggish as hydraulics leaked. "We're not going to make it," Henderson shouted over sounds of impacts and warning horns. "Aircraft is too damaged. We need to abort." "Negative. ARVN troops are depending on us. We're landing." My decision, made knowing it might kill everyone aboard, but believing that abandoning soldiers was worse than risking the crew. The landing was a controlled crash more than normal touchdown. Collective bottomed out to arrest the descent that was too fast. Skids hitting hard enough to damage landing gear. Aircraft settling askew but intact. ARVN soldiers immediately began loading, wounded first, walking wounded helping them, everyone moving with speed born from knowledge that the helicopter wouldn't wait, and this might be the last extraction. "Get them loaded, fast as possible. We're taking too much fire," I shouted toward Specialist Miller, who was directing loading while firing door gun toward NVA positions. The helicopter was loaded beyond capacity, seats full, floor full, soldiers hanging on skids because getting out mattered more than maintaining weight limits. I pulled maximum power, felt the aircraft struggle to lift, rotor RPM dropping dangerously low as engine screamed trying to generate thrust that physics said wasn't possible. "We're too heavy. We're not going to clear the hill," Henderson's voice, noting that we were barely climbing, that hillside ahead was approaching faster than we were gaining altitude. "Hold on, this is going to be close." My response, while maintaining maximum collective despite knowing that engine over torque might cause mechanical failure, knowing that clearing the hillside mattered more than maintaining operational parameters. We cleared the hillside with meters to spare, aircraft shuddering from strain, soldiers hanging on skids screaming as we barely missed trees. The return flight was 20 kilometers that felt like forever. Aircraft damaged, overloaded, systems failing progressively,
but staying airborne through a combination of skill and luck. We made it back to base in South Vietnam, landed with hydraulics completely failed, requiring running landing because cyclic and collective were frozen, but everyone aboard survived. The mission earned me the Distinguished Flying Cross, a second, adding to the medal earned previous year. But the medal seemed inadequate recognition for what had become routine, flying missions that should have been impossible, saving soldiers who would have died without extraction, accepting risks that exceeded what training suggested were survivable. Not everyone survived. Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Rodriguez was shot down during extraction mission March 3rd, aircraft hit by anti-aircraft fire that destroyed engine, crashed in NVA-controlled territory, where rescue was impossible. Rodriguez and his crew were killed in the crash or immediately afterward by NVA soldiers who didn't take prisoners during Lam Son 719. His death was one of dozens that accumulated as operation continued beyond the point where withdrawal should have been completed.
By March 10th, ARVN forces had mostly withdrawn from Laos. The operation was declared a success based on enemy casualties and supplies destroyed, though actual achievements fell far short of objectives. American aviation had lost 108 helicopters destroyed and over 600 damaged, losses that exceeded total helicopter inventory of some countries' entire military. American casualties were approximately 1,500, mostly aircrew, demonstrating that air support without ground presence meant aviators absorbed casualties that ground forces would normally suffer. The ARVN casualties were catastrophic. Official numbers claimed approximately 1,500 killed and 5,000 wounded, but actual losses probably exceeded 50% of forces committed to operation. Units that entered Laos as cohesive military organizations returned as shattered remnants. Equipment losses included tanks, artillery, weapons, much of it abandoned during retreat when maintaining cohesion was impossible. The political impact of Lam Son 719 exceeded military consequences. The operation was supposed to demonstrate Vietnamization's success, to prove ARVN could fight effectively without American ground forces. Instead, it demonstrated opposite, that without American ground troops, ARVN couldn't conduct sustained offensive operations, that air support alone was insufficient, that turning war over to South Vietnamese forces meant accepting defeat. Media coverage was devastating. Journalists who'd been embedded with units purported wholesale collapse of ARVN discipline during retreat, published photographs of ARVN soldiers clinging to helicopter skids because they'd abandoned ground and flight was only escape. The images contradicted official narratives about ARVN effectiveness, raised questions about whether American training and equipment could compensate for leadership and motivation deficiencies. I survived Lam Son 719 and completed my tour in June 1971. Made it home to Montana, where war was deeply unpopular, where helicopter pilots were either ignored or criticized for participating in an operation that killed American aviators supporting South Vietnamese forces who'd failed. The Distinguished Flying Crosses and Air Medals seemed hollow recognition for missions that had cost brothers who'd been flying beside me. The lessons of Lam Son 719 should have ended Vietnamization immediately. The operation proved conclusively that ARVN couldn't fight effectively without American ground forces, that air support alone was insufficient, that turning war over to South Vietnamese forces meant accepting defeat. But political commitment to withdrawal was too strong to reverse based on military failure. Vietnamization continued despite Lam Son 719's evidence that it was failing, continued through final American withdrawal in 1973, continued until Saigon fell in 1975, proving what Lam Son 719 had demonstrated 4 years earlier. The sound of helicopters still triggers memories. Instantly, I'm back over Laos, seeing tracers arcing toward aircraft, feeling impacts as rounds punch through aluminum, hearing Henderson's voice announcing we're going down. I can't watch movies featuring helicopter combat without experiencing physical reactions, elevated heart rate, sweating, hypervigilance. The trauma is permanent, managed rather than eliminated. But I survived.
and survival means obligation. To remember 108 helicopters lost and crews who died flying them. To tell story of Lam Son 719 operation that cost American aviators supporting South Vietnamese forces who couldn't achieve objectives. To ensure that soldiers who died proving Vietnamization was failing aren't forgotten. This was Lam Son 719, the invasion of Laos that became the bloodiest helicopter battle in American military history. The operation that proved Vietnamization was failing despite political commitment to continuing it. This is their story.